Hello, everybody. Professor Barth here, Associate Professor of History at Arizona State University. Welcome to part 4 of the World of Thucydides, Pericles in the Peloponnesian War. This is part of a new series entitled Foundations of Western Political Thought. We've taken a look at Thucydides, that great historian of ancient Greece, the author of the history of the Peloponnesian War. If you haven't already seen part 3, you're going to want to do so. In it, we examine the chief differences between Athens and Sparta. But for part 4, we're going to read through some excerpts from 2 of Pericles' most important speeches, as recorded for us by Thucydides. Why am I taking the time to record a video looking at the speeches of Pericles? Well, in it, I believe that you will find timeless truths that transcend ancient Greece and apply every bit as much to the world of the 21st century. In these speeches, Pericles emphasizes the importance, the necessity in any thriving civilization of certain masculine virtues. And what are those masculine virtues? Courage, honor, duty, strength. Not just physical strength, but mental strength. Pericles championed men of action, men of decisiveness, men of wisdom, knowledge, and temperance, and that great virtue of patriotism, love for one's country. All of those virtues we find in 2 of Pericles' speeches, again, recorded for us by Thucydides. Now, the war itself, the Peloponnesian War, between the Athenian Delian League and the Spartan-led Peloponnesian League, the details of that war are not important for our purposes. It's very interesting, don't get me wrong, but for our purposes, we're going to I think just the absolute rudimentary basics of the start of that war are sufficient. Thucydides wrote famously in his history, quote, "The growth of the power of Athens and the alarm this inspired in Lacedaemon, or Sparta, made war inevitable." Made war inevitable. Political scientists today call this the Thucydides Trap, when you have an emerging power rivaling an existing power. In this case, Sparta, the existing power, the emerging power, Athens. As the Delian League morphed into an Athenian empire and just utterly dominated the Aegean Sea. Some analysts today have applied this idea of the Thucydides Trap to international relations between the United States and China. Whether or not there's anything to that, that's a different subject. But Thucydides saw war as inevitable, and sure enough, it broke out officially in 431. Again, the details aren't terribly important. Actually, it has to do with Corcyra. Part 2 of this series, we looked at the civil war in Corcyra and what Thucydides gleaned about human nature from that civil war. Corcyra was a major sea power, rising naval power, as was Corinth. Corcyra was a former Corinthian colony. Tension grew between the two, between Corcyra and Corinth. Corcyra, fearing Corinthian aggression, appealed to Athens for support. Athens provided support. Corinth then turned to Sparta to counter this Athenian move, and war erupted. Now, Pericles was the preeminent political leader of Athens at the time, and had been now for 3 decades. The great general, the great statesman. Athens' chief strength was its navy, those triremes. And it has an infantry as well, but the the main strength for Athens is its navy, and Pericles understood that. Pericles pursued a fairly moderate course at the beginning of the war. He knew that Sparta, with its massive land armies, had an advantage on land, and so Pericles' strategy was to pursue a naval war and then retreat behind Athens' famous city walls, which Pericles had expanded in the decades leading up to war. This is the famous Long Wall. There's Athens that extended to the coast, and at first this seemed to be a very good strategy. Sparta launched repeated invasions of Attica. Attica was the region surrounding Athens, and so Pericles had most of Attica retreat behind the Athenian walls. And then because the Spartans had such a large slave or helot population back home, they could not sustain a long occupation of Attica, and so this strategy for Sparta did not work, and Athens was able to rely on its naval supremacy and to harass Spartan troop movements off the Peloponnesian coast. And so the war begins. What a war it was. Now, at the end of the first year of war, a funeral was held for the war dead in Athens. The remains of the dead were gathered, offerings were made, funeral procession was had, and then Pericles made a speech, his famous Funeral Oration, and it's a powerful speech, as you will see. Now, the speech is recorded for us, word for word, in the history of the Peloponnesian War. Thucydides was almost certainly present. In the preface to this book, Thucydides explains his methodology as a historian. He said what particular people said in their speeches, like Pericles, either just before or during the war, was hard to recall exactly, whether they were speeches I heard myself, and again, I reckon that this was one that he did hear himself, or those that were reported to me at second hand. An example of this would be the Melian dialogue, which we'll see in part 5, and that will be the concluding part for this Thucydides series. I've made each speaker say what I thought his situation demanded. That's an interesting explanation. Keeping as near as possible to the general sense of what was actually said. And so historians have subsequently debated how accurate is a speech. I actually think that for the most part, this is an accurate telling of what Pericles said in this funeral oration, but no doubt Thucydides adds a few things here or there. So, Pericles delivers a speech. Let's see what he has to say. The customs that brought us to this point, the form of government and the way of life that have made our city great, these I shall disclose, he says. We have a form of government in Athens that does not try to imitate the laws of our neighboring states. We are more an example to others than they to us. So here we see Pericles attempting to stoke pride in the Athenian model. This is a unique model, a distinctive model, something to be an exceptional model, something to take great pride in as a city. In name, it is called a democracy. Demos, kratos, people, power. In name, it is called a democracy because it is managed not for a few people, but for the majority. Now, Sparta had an oligarchy, and if you look at the word oligarchy, it means ruled by the few. But defenders of Sparta would say, well, yes, it's an oligarchy, but it was separate, it was distinct from a tyranny because that oligarchy indeed ruled for the public good of the majority of Sparta. That's certainly debatable. But what Pericles is talking about here is popular participation in government. Government, the consent of the people. Government in which ordinary citizens, tens of thousands of citizens actually, were able to directly participate, to vote, to attend the ecclesia, the assembly. This is something to take great pride in. We are free and generous not only in our public activities as citizens, but also in our daily lives. There is no suspicion in our dealings with one another, and we are not offended by our neighbor for following his own pleasure. A society of liberty. We live together without taking offense on private matters. And as for public affairs, we respect the law greatly and fear to violate it, especially to those laws that were made to help people who have suffered an injustice. And what Pericles is talking about here is the rule of law. The rule of law. And the concept of the rule of law, I think I'm persuaded we take for granted as Americans. We just assume that the rule of law is the norm. The rule of law is not the norm in history. Okay? You understand that? The rule of law is not the norm in history, nor, by the way, is it the norm globally today. The rule of law is not the norm. The rule of law protects the individual against arbitrary power, against arbitrary government. It means that one is entitled to the same process, the same rules, the same body of laws governs things. A few decades later, quite a few decades later, Aristotle, in the 4th century, authored a book entitled Politics. And Aristotle explained, it is more proper that law should govern. That law should govern than any one of the citizens. See, this is why constitutionalism is so important. Constitutionalism is the idea that the Constitution is the supreme law. The law governs the land. Not some dictator, not some tyrant, not some body of tyrants. Even if they call themselves a Congress or a court or whatever. No, the law governs. The law governs. And everyone, and nobody is above the law. Everyone is under the same law, the same process, the same rules. This is the classical definition of equality. Thomas Sowell calls this process equality. Not results equality, but process equality. A very important distinction. Aristotle says, upon the same principle, if it is advantageous to place the supreme power in some particular persons, they should be appointed to be only guardians and the servants of the laws. So the law is supreme. And Thucydides is saying, hey, look, this is something to take great pride in. We have a democracy, consent to the governed, popular participation in government, and we have a general sentiment of liberty in our day-to-day interactions, and we have rule of law. He continues, we are lovers of nobility with restraint, and lovers of wisdom without any softening of character. We use wealth as an opportunity for action rather than for boastful speeches. And as for poverty, we think there is no shame in confessing it. What is shameful is doing nothing to escape it. The very men who take care of public affairs look after their own at the same time, and even those who are devoted to their own businesses know enough about the city's affairs. A man who does not take part in public affairs is good for nothing. What is Pericles saying here? Is that, again, this idea of popular participation in government. This is part of one's civic duty. This is a duty of citizenship. A duty of citizenship that in the polis, the city, in the polis, the citizens of the polis all participate. They all participate, and it's their duty. Okay? JFK famously said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." It's become a bit cliche, but this is what Pericles is saying here, that you have a duty to take part in public affairs. What spoils action is not speeches, but going into action without first being instructed through speeches. So the importance of knowledge is what Thucydides is, or what Pericles is emphasizing here. You don't want to be rash and reckless. No, you need to be instructed before going into action. And then when you are instructed, you must act. People who think through what they will take in hand and discuss it thoroughly. Those who know exactly what terrors or pleasures lie ahead and are not turned away from danger by that knowledge. So courage. So you want knowledge. You need to know the terrors or pleasures that lie ahead. So you need that knowledge. But you have the courage to not be turned away from danger by that knowledge. In sum, I say that our city as a whole is a lesson for Greece, in that each of us presents himself as a self-sufficient individual, disposed to the widest possible diversity of actions, with every grace and great versatility. So liberty, something to take great pride in. This is not merely a boast in words for the occasion, but the truth and fact. Pericles is saying, look, this isn't just our subjective feeling here, that our model, that our framework of government is the best, that it is the most exceptional model, that it is a lesson for Greece. That's not just our subjective opinion. It is truth in fact. So here we see Pericles, a patriotism, but one not rooted in sort of this blind patriotism, but an overwhelming conviction that this is the best. This is the most exceptional. This is something to die for. Remember, this is a funeral oration. This is Pericles delivering a speech honoring the dead, honoring those who risked their lives for Athens. Such is the city for which these men fought valiantly and died. None of them became a coward because he set a higher value on enjoying the wealth that he had. None of them put off the terrible day of his death in hopes that he might overcome his poverty and attain riches. What did Christ say? Store your treasures in heaven and not on earth. Those who put their value, their hope in this earthly, temporal, very, very fleeting, in truth, vain life, that is not where happiness lies. None of them became a coward because he set a higher value on enjoying the wealth that he had, or in hopes that he might overcome his poverty and attain riches. None of them became a coward. Their longing to punish their enemies was stronger than this. And because they believed this to be the most honorable sort of danger, they chose to punish their enemies at this risk and to let everything else go. Are you willing to risk everything in pursuit of a higher cause? You should. You should. That's where true, that's called bravery. That's called honor, duty, and strength. Not just physical strength. You see a lot of guys at the gym all the time working out hours on end, and yeah, they've got physical strength. Do they have mental strength? Do they have true courage? Do they have honor? Do they have duty? Some of them do, but a lot of them don't. It's more than physical strength. Being a man is so much greater than that, and such a greater responsibility than that. The uncertainty of success they entrusted to hope. They didn't know if they were going to win. They didn't know that victory was coming. Hey, look, Athens loses this war, and the men here died in battle. The uncertainty of success they entrusted to hope. For that which was before their eyes, they decided to rely on themselves in action. They were men of action, men of decisiveness. Be decisive men. They believed that this choice entailed resistance and suffering rather than surrender and safety. They ran away from the word shame and stood up in action at risk of their lives. Honor. For in giving their lives for the common good, each man won praise for himself that will never grow old. And look, here we are reading these words 2.5 millennia later. How about that? Not bad. Each man won praise for himself that will never grow old. Try to be like these men, therefore. Realize that happiness lies in liberty in valor, and do not hold back from the dangers of war. You think you can have liberty without valor? Not possible. It's not possible. You must have valor if you are to have liberty. You must have virtue in order to have liberty. The Founding Fathers understood this. They wrote a whole lot about it, actually. You can't have a free society unless you have a virtuous society. You can't have a free society unless you have a valiant society. Men who do not hold back from the dangers of war. Miserable men who have no hope of prosperity do not have a just reason to be generous with their lives. No, it is rather those who face the danger of a complete reversal of fortune for whom defeat would make the biggest difference. They are the ones who should risk their lives. They are the ones with, as we would say today, who have skin in the game. And they are the ones who will risk their lives. Any man of intelligence will hold that death, when it comes unperceived to a man at full strength and with hope for his country, is not so bitter as miserable defeat for a man grown soft. Pericles' Funeral Oration, delivered at the end of the first year of the Peloponnesian War. Wow. Oh, we're not done. We've got one more speech. Ooh, war is a violent teacher. Human nature really rears its ugly head in times of calamity, in times of crisis, in times of instability. And that's what came to Athens just a few short months after. In 430 BC, Athens was struck by a severe plague, a plague that killed off, estimates are, between a quarter to a third of the city. Athens was a very densely packed city. A quarter to a third of the entire population killed off by this terrible plague. Perhaps as many as 100,000 people. Throughout the city, there were large funeral pyres. The dead were just heaped up on top of one another. Mass graves. Many of the Athenian sailors and hoplites died of the plague. It crippled the Athenian military. It was a huge blow to Athenian morale, both among the citizenry and in the military. Oh, and it had a destructive impact on Athenian society. By the way, Pericles contracted it, dies of it, in 429. He was 65 years old when he died of the plague. Thucydides also contracted the plague. I mean, so again, Thucydides is there. He's right in the middle of all this. So he heard that funeral oration. He's about to hear this upcoming speech too. He contracted the plague but survived. It's a good thing he survived. We wouldn't have record of a whole lot of this if he didn't make it. But he has this to say: in his history of the Peloponnesian War on the plague. The catastrophe was so overwhelming that men, not knowing what would happen next to them, became indifferent to every rule of religion or law. It became a lawless society, anarchy, chaos. Thucydides tells us that people started spending money just left and right because they couldn't assume that they would live any longer. It caused a lot of doubt and skepticism of the ability of the Athenian gods to come in and to intervene. A lot of the temples were just filled with stacks of bodies, which seemed to made a mockery of the pagan gods of the city. Some people took it actually to mean that the gods favored Sparta. Thucydides dismisses this and attributed it to a naturalistic explanation in line with his empirical approach to history. Human nature laid bare. The population, by the way, turned against Thucydides, or against Pericles. Pericles, that great statesman, the leader, the preeminent political leader of Athens, the first citizens of Athens, as Thucydides called him, for 30 years. The democracy turned against him, blamed him for the plague, just looking for a scapegoat. It's a weakness in democracy. It's a weakness in democracy. Public opinion is fickle and wants to blame somebody, even somebody who has nothing to do with it. Well, Pericles gives his last speech, delivers his last speech there in Athens, and in this speech he attempts to rally Athens. It's sort of a last-ditch attempt to rally Athens in the midst of just total calamity. I mean, if you were to take this in proportion to the U.S. population, this would be akin to 80 to 90 million Americans dying of the plague. Makes COVID look like a total cakewalk. Just absolute calamity. Well, Pericles delivers a speech. It does not matter, he told the population. Now, before we proceed, imagine, here's Pericles. He's in a public square somewhere in Athens. and here he is. He's got it. And the people are, at best, extremely skeptical of his leadership, if not outright hostile. And there's Pericles. And this war's just gotten started with Sparta. It does not matter whether a man prospers as an individual. If his country is destroyed, he is lost along with it. But if he meets with misfortune, he is far safer in a fortunate city than he would be otherwise. What's Pericles saying here? Look, patriotism, your country needs to come first, because at the end of the day, if your country is destroyed, it doesn't matter how much money you have. That's one of the things I don't understand about a lot of these making millionaires and billionaires who don't seem to take any stock or appreciation for our Constitution, our rule of law, of liberty, American liberty. And it's like, man, do you not understand? It doesn't matter how much money and wealth you have and how much power you have. If the country's wrecked and becomes just divided and everyone's at odds with one another and fighting amongst each other, it doesn't matter how much money you have. I'd rather be poor in a fortunate city in a thriving country. I'd rather be a poor man in a thriving country than a rich man in a wrecked country. Pericles is trying to rally people. Look, we gotta save this. We've got to save our city. We don't have a choice. If we hold fast to our liberty, see, because the temptation, whenever calamity comes, the temptation in democracies is to lunge toward authoritarianism. Because the masses, the people, they want a savior, really. They get nervous and extremely panicky, and that's when the demagogue can come in, and liberty is lost. Pericles, this is an appeal: hold fast to liberty. If we hold fast to our liberty and preserve it, we will easily recover our land and houses. The picture's not pretty right now, but if we hold fast to our liberty, we will easily recover it. But people who submit to foreign domination will lose what they already had. If we allow this to destroy us and Sparta takes over, it's over. It's over. It's more shameful to lose what you have than to fail in an attempt to get more. Ain't that the truth? And isn't that the message that needs to go out in America right now? It is more shameful to lose what you have. What do we have in this country? We have a Declaration of Independence and we have a Constitution. You realize how precious our laws and Constitution are? Most Americans take all of this for granted. The freedom of speech, the rule of law, the Bill of Rights, all of it. We take it for granted. We're born in it, and maybe we go back generations. Our grandparents lived in it, our great-great-grandparents. And you take it for granted. It is. And then it slips away. It is more shameful to lose what you have. It is more shameful to lose what you have than to fail in an attempt to get more. Hold fast to your liberty. And do not think that the only thing we are fighting for is our freedom from being subjugated. You are in danger of losing the empire, and if you do, the anger of the people you have ruled will raise other dangers. So here, Pericles is saying, look, there could, not only will you lose your liberty, there could be other unintended consequences here. I don't know if you noticed, Pericles says, but we've built an empire here, and there are people who resent our empire. There are people who don't like our empire, and he says this, you are in no position to walk away from your empire. So you've built this great empire. You can't just walk away from it. Though some people might propose to do so from fear of the current situation and act the part of virtue because they do not want to be involved in public affairs. You see, your empire is really like a tyranny, Pericles continues. Though it may have been thought unjust to seize, it is now unsafe to surrender. And boy, there's a lot of application perhaps that can be made to the United States, to the American empire, because we do have an empire. You realize that we have an empire. We don't like to see it as such. Like the Athenians, the Athenians called it Delian League. It's an Athenian empire. America's got an empire. We're the global, or if you don't like the word empire, we're the global superpower. It may have been thought unjust to seize, but is now unsafe to surrender. Here we see that political realism, that Realpolitik, that's part of Thucydides' philosophy, come through. Realpolitik, that state policy must primarily or solely focus on maintaining political, economic, and military strength, security, and power. And there's tension here between Thucydides' Realpolitik and Pericles' ideals, because Pericles has been talking a whole lot about the ideals. And then all of a sudden we've got Realpolitik in here with the talk of the empire. And there is a tension here, isn't there? For all the talk of liberty and rule of law. And then he says, oh, but you have an empire, you better watch it. You better watch. You better be careful not to let go of that empire too quickly, because the people who resent your imperial power may exact some revenge. Realpolitik, something very interesting to consider in light of all the abstract ideals that we have covered up to this point. Keep this in mind, Pericles says. Our city is famous everywhere for its greatness and not yielding to adversity, and in accepting so many casualties and so much trouble in war. Again, trying to rally the city. What are we known for? Liberty, yes, but what else? And not yielding to adversity. This plague is catastrophic. It's killed off a third of our people. But we must not yield to adversity. That is what our city is famous for. Besides, she has possessed great power till now, which will be remembered forever by those who come after us, even 2.5 millennia later. Even if we do give way a little now. For everything naturally goes into decline. And he's saying, we'll be remembered forever by those who come after us. Even if we do give way a little now, he's predicting, maybe prophesizing here, maybe Athens will decline. For everything naturally goes into decline. I'm going to jump in here and say that sounds like Thucydides. Maybe Pericles said that, but I've got a strong hunch that at least what you see there in the parentheses, and the parentheses weren't in the original Greek, but at this little line here, that's Thucydides speaking. Thucydides interjecting his views on human nature. Thucydides reminds us, look, everything naturally goes into decline. It's just how human nature is. It's how the nature of civilizations are. Civilizations rise and civilizations fall. Isn't that the story of world history? Has there ever been an empire that just lasted and lasted and lasted? No, there's never has. Not even the British Empire could make it all the way. I mean, no offense to my viewers from the UK. The UK is a very respectable, country, of course. Love Britain, but the British Empire is no more. British Empire is no more. Everything naturally goes into decline. Pericles continues. To be hated and to cause pain is, at present, the reality for anyone who takes on the rule of others. Great powers and great men will from time to time be hated by the public. And anyone who makes himself hated for matters of great consequence has made the right decision. For hatred does not last long, but the momentary brilliance of great actions lives on as a glory that will be remembered forever after. He's saying, look, sometimes you've got to do the unpopular thing. Sometimes as a leader or as an empire, you've got to do the unpopular thing, even if it means for the time being that you will be disliked or even hated in an extremity. But the hatred does not last long. The momentary brilliance of great actions lives on as a glory that will be remembered forever after. Now, this can be difficult in a democracy, because in a democracy where majority rules, it's very difficult sometimes to take those necessary actions that are going to be unpopular, even if they're the right actions, even if they're the right decisions. It's very difficult to accomplish that in a democracy, because the democracy will then remove you from power, will then vote you down, will turn against you, even if it was the right decision. But that's a cost of democracy. Perhaps it's worth it in order to have consent of the governed and participation in government. But it's a feature of democracy. It's one of the features of democracy. The most powerful cities and individuals are the ones that are the least sensitive in their minds to calamity and the firmest in their actions to resist it. You've got to have a strong mind. As an individual, you've got to have mental strength, that courage. Mental strength. Calamity strikes, tribulation comes, problems and troubles come about. Your mind should not be ultra sensitive to those things. It's one of the most alarming aspects of the latest COVID hysteria that really bothered me. Man, it didn't take much for American society, and not just American society, but much of the world, to just lose their minds over, yes, a deadly disease for many people, but no perspective at all. It's like, we're going to lose our minds over a virus that for healthy adults is comparable, maybe a little worse than the flu. Maybe a little worse than the flu. If you're an older adult, or if you have a compromised immune system, yeah, it was a bit deadlier than the flu. Granted, quite a bit deadlier, perhaps for some people. But for the society as a whole, and for individuals to lose their mind, you see perfectly young, healthy people walking around still wearing N95 mask. Is that a strong mind? the most powerful cities and individuals. So it's also a collective project. It's an individual project, also a collective project. As a country, as a city, the most powerful cities and individuals are the ones that are the least sensitive in their minds to calamity and the firmest in their actions to resist it. And resistance to calamity often takes the form of not allowing the people to just throw their hands up and surrender their liberty. Pericles dies in 429 BC at the age of 65 years old. After his death, he was succeeded by a series of demagogues, by a general, Athenian general Cleon, who abandoned Pericles' wise, more moderate, conservative, defensive strategy in the war and he was a big hawk. He wanted to bring it offensively to the Spartans. Thucydides tells us that Cleon, and Thucydides was not the only one to tell us this. Aristophanes, the great playwright, repeated the same. Cleon was reckless, impulsive. And then Thucydides gives us his judgment of Pericles as a leader, as a statesman. As long as he was at the head of the city in time of peace, Thucydides tells us of Pericles, he governed it with moderation and guarded it securely, and it was greatest under him. So Thucydides was skeptical of democracy. He's not if you haven't figured it out already, he's not the biggest fan of democracy, but a Periclean democracy, Thucydides says it can work very well, because it has a strong, virtuous leader, as we saw in those speeches. He lived 2 years and 6 months after the war began, and after his death, his foresight about the war was even better recognized, for he told them that if they would be quiet and take care of their navy and not seek to expand the empire during this war or endanger the city itself, they should then have the upper hand. His advice wasn't followed, was it? But they did the opposite on all points. And in other things that seemed not to concern the war, they managed the state for their private ambition and private gain to the detriment of themselves and their allies. The reason, Thucydides continues, for Pericles' success was this. He was powerful because of his prestige and his intelligence, and also because he was known to be highly incorruptible. He therefore controlled the people without inhibition, and was not so much led by them as he led them. So because he had the respect of the people, because the people trusted him like a General Washington. I mean, George Washington, what a great president. Why was he a great president? He commanded the respect of the nation. He was known to be highly incorruptible. And so he was not so much led by them as he led them, like a shepherd. You don't want the sheep leading the shepherd. You want the shepherd leading the sheep and protecting the sheep from the wolves. And that's what Pericles did. He would not humor the people in his speeches so as to get power by improper means, like a demagogue, but because of their esteem for him, he could risk their anger by opposing them. Now, sometimes their anger was so great that they still blamed him anyway, but because he commanded so much respect, because of their esteem for him, he could do unpopular things without risking, a revolution. He could do those things that he deemed necessary, those actions that were requisite in time of war or in time of peace, even if the public wasn't entirely on board. He could do those things because of their esteem for him. That's a sign of a good, strong leader. Even in a democracy, that's a sign of an effective leader. Therefore, whenever he saw them insolently bold out of season, he would put them into fear with his speeches. And again, when they were afraid without reason, he would raise up their spirits and give them courage. So when the people want to, when they're rash and they want to act, and it's not wise to act. You want to be a little more prudent. You want to calm down a little bit. He'd put fear into them with his speech and say, look, this is what you want to do is dangerous. We don't want to do this. But when they were afraid without reason, he'd raise up their spirits, like we saw in his last speech or in his funeral oration. Gave them courage when they most needed it. A sign of an effective leader. Man, our country and our world today is crying out for leadership. We need a Pericles. We need a Pericles. Where is Pericles? Athens was in name a democracy, Thucydides continues, but in fact was a government by its first man. But because those who came after were more equal among themselves, with everyone aiming to be the chief, they gave up taking care of the commonwealth in order to please the people. There was no... Pericles, his shoes were too big to fill. They were too big to fill. Nobody was able to do it, and then everyone's aspiring for power and ambition, and it got ugly. And people-pleasing, because there was no natural leader who just naturally earned the respect and the esteem of the people. If you wanted to rise to political power, you had to please the masses in ways that were were unwise, that led to bad policy, a danger in any democracy. So the war continued on for 10 years after it began in 431. Then in 421 BC, there was a brief peace, a tepid peace that lasted about 6 years. And then war erupted again. War erupted again in 415 BC. And just prior to the war starting up again in 415 BC between the Delian League, the Athenian Empire, and the Peloponnesian League led by Sparta and Corinth, just before the opening up of the second phase of the war, Athens laid siege to the only significant island in the Aegean Sea that was free of Athenian control, and that was Melos. And so for part 5, in the final part of this series on Thucydides, we're going to look at the Melian dialogue. Ooh, the Melian dialogue is great. There's some difficult questions and issues to wrestle with, and as we will read that dialogue. Recorded to us by Thucydides. He was not there, almost certainly was not there. Probably heard secondhand. What a dialogue it is. We'll look at that in part 5. I hope you enjoyed this fourth lecture, this fourth installment. I know it was a bit lengthy, but I trust that you will find much of it helpful, maybe even edifying. So until then, take care. God bless. Bye.